Welcome to another episode of the Azure Takeoff Show. Today, we have Tashwar with us. Hi, Tashwar. How are you?
Hi, team. How are you?
I'm doing good. So, Tashwar, we talked about Azure storage, we talked about compute, we talked about how we can actually make applications. So, what are we going to talk about today?
Okay. So I thought, again, like let's step back a little bit too, because what I've realized is actually you and me both know Azure quite well, right? And we might take it for granted of like how we know already things. So I wanted to step back a little bit and maybe talk about regions, subscription, and resources. What do these things actually mean inside of Azure?
That is great. So let's understand what exactly Azure regions are, what are the subscriptions, and let's go a deep dive into it.
Sure, sounds good. Let me just share my slide. So as you could know, there's like 60 plus Azure regions. What does it mean, regions? Regions are basically a location, a physical location of a data center. That's what we call a region, basically. Inside of Microsoft, as you can see all these blue dots over there, there's lots of regions. There's regions in India, there's region in UAE, there's region in US, there's different regions in US too, US East 1, US East 2. So there's quite a lot of like basically regions all over where you could actually launch your applications or your data onto these data centers, which are Microsoft regions. So when you look at regions, there's all these little dots, and they're all connected through fiber cable. Basically, each one of these regions is connected through another fiber cable of other regions.
So Tashwar, I see there are 60 plus Azure regions over here,
Mm.
and there are more than 200 data centers. But I had one question about what exactly a network pop or an edge zone is, because I see one network pop around your region, and there is
Mm.
one network pop around my region as well. So I wanted to understand what exactly network pops are.
So basically, these are partners, ISPs, that actually are connected directly to Azure. Basically, so those are called network part. Edge are basically more like a little smaller sort of a data center that you could actually utilize on like edge located, or even CDNs related to it that has direct connection to Azure. Basically, those are what edge and network pop basically means.
That is great. That's great.
So moving forward, like you see all these regions sort of thing, and then like so there's a specific region. Let's use the example of UAE. So we got a UAE region, and if you move forward, there's also something called availability zones. Okay, what are these availability zones? Basically, you can't think of just one building. Basically, the building could have multiple floors, right? There are multiple floors to building. So you might choose a VM inside floor 5, for example, or there could be multiple buildings too. So let's say that you choose floor 5, your availability zone could be floor 8 or something too, because now you have two different floors. They might have different like cooling. If cooling fails on one floor, does not necessarily mean that floor eight's cooling is going to be failing too, right? So that's how you could actually have availability zone. Now it could be separate buildings too. You could have building A and building B, and you might have like actually your application running on different availability zones. So basically, so now when you talk about availability zone, it could be actually separated quite far away too. Doesn't necessarily need to be building or anything like that. It could be separated quite far away. Now the next thing that actually all of these availability zones are connected to fiber optics, basically from one to the other. So all these buildings and everything else are connected. So you could think of it as a separate data centers in some ways. So it could be one building over on the east of the city and one building on the west of the city, kind of thing. So that
Got
could
it.
be the availability zones, because something that happens, let's say there's flooding on the east, there might be a possibility of nothing happening on the west, or snowing on the east, or raining on the east and no rain on the west. But Dubai, it rains all the time.
Right. That's right.
Okay, now there's also this other thing called region pairs, basically. So what region pairs actually is 300 miles between each. So what are these region pairs? You're like, okay, different floors and stuff. Like, okay, what if the whole electricity goes away in this whole area, sort of thing? Then what happens? So Azure has this neat thing called region pairs. So what are region pairs is basically, so again, I'm going to use an analogy of like Dubai again. Maybe there's a region in Sharjah and one in UAE, sort of thing, or maybe Abu Dhabi. They're like an hour away or something like that. So Abu Dhabi and Dubai, basically. So let's say there's two regions. So those are the region pairs. So what happens is like It's for free for customers. They don't actually see this, but this is inside us. So when we do an update, we do it on one, and then we see if everything's going on. Then we apply it on the other one. So in some ways, when you launch an application inside of region A, for example, it automatically duplicates on region B too. So Azure is providing you with this service for free so that you could actually have your disaster recovery kind of thing covered, sort of thing. If something happens to Azure, you as a customer are not affected. And you can see from here, let's say I'll pick Canada Central. Canada is a pretty big country. Canada Central has one region, and actually the region pair is all the way in east of Canada.
Yeah.
So it's pretty far away, 300 miles away from each other. I know Abu Dhabi and like Dubai doesn't give a justice, but like so Brazil, like India, India is huge country too. There's a region in India South, and its region pair is India Central, which is quite far
Correct.
away in the center of it. So I mean, this is like how automatically replication happens between our application. Now there's a priority to things too. So it's not like everything is replicated. Like for example, your databases and all that stuff is replicated, but maybe your monitoring doesn't need to be replicated to everywhere else. So I mean, there are certain things that actually do not get replicated automatically. But I mean, we try to make the best out of it to make sure it works. Now, there's also one extra thing that I forgot to mention is actually where are your service going to be running also matters too, because not every region provides you with all the services that you need. So it's, certain regions may not have a certain new product, for example. Eventually, it might be trickling down there, but they might not have this specific new thing that they actually release, for example. Now, there's also one core important thing is actually not every region is the same price. So I mean, like you might launch in North US, the price of a VM would be different than launching in Brazil, for example. So you need to account for that. Now, the most important thing again for yes, price is important, but you need to really find out where is your customer. So if your customer is in Brazil, it doesn't make sense to launch something in Asia, for example. But if you're a
Yes.
worldwide kind of thing, then yeah, you should be launching where your customers are so that they get a fast, instant kind of access to your application and your data, basically. Cool.
Agree. And actually, I can relate that with our UAE regions as well. So in UAE, we have a UAE North and a UAE Central.
Mhm.
So yes, we don't know whether one is in Dubai and one is in Abu Dhabi, but yes, we have a region pair, which is the UAE North and the UAE Central. Now, I have one question over here.
Mhm.
Is looking at the screen. Uh, if at all I want to actually host my application in North Central US, the region pair is added as a South Central US. What if I publish my application to Central US? Does it go around to the pair, or we can only push it, or you can deploy your application to the primary region and then
So
it will work for regional pairs?
again, the region pair is more like a thing that customers don't really see, sort of thing. It's for your disaster recovery, sort of thing. You pick the region that you want to be. Azure picks the pair for you, so that automatically, if something happens in earthquake happens in like East US, West US is not going to be affected, right? So it's
Yes.
automatically paired with it, so that we could actually deploy your application there. It's free of charge. It's just more like a backup recovery sort of thing. I mean, you should always have your own backup recovery plan, as in like if something fails in East, I might launch it in like Central or something like that. But like this is automatically to making sure that if certain things goes wrong, at least your data and everything else is saved in some ways.
Got it.
So,
Got it.
so that's
Clear.
think of it as a plan of like Azure to protect you.
Yes.
Okay, so now let's move on to what are Azure Resources, basically. What are Azure Resources? Azure Resources is the main fundamental component of like everything that you do, basically. It could be a virtual machine, storage account, functions, Azure Functions, SQL databases, app services. These are the low-level resources. Anything that you create is a resource. Now, there's a limitation of a resource. Basically, you could create a resource and actually store those things of it. Now, resource are actually put into something what we call a resource group. So let me show you what resource group is. Okay, here's what it is. So when you have a resource, let's say a VM and a database, you actually put it into something called very fundamental to Azure. It's called a resource group. So you put a group and then you put your items inside of it. Think of it as a basket. So you have a
Yes.
basket and you put your items inside of it. So this actually aggregates into a level of like things that you could do. Now there's a limitation, as in like I cannot put a VM in one resource group and also share it with another resource group, basically. So it's not like a VM could be living in resource group A and also live in resource group B. Now you could have three resource group. For example, in here you see on the top you see that there's one resource group that contains the three items: Cosmos DB, a VM, and some data. Or you could divide it into three resource group, where it's the web application consists of its own resource group, the virtual machines is own, the storage is its own. So these are all the resource group that you could do. Uh, Resources can exist in different regions too. So it doesn't mean that you could just have a resource group that is there. They could live in different regions. Basically, think of it as a logical thing that you're storing, a bucket of things that you're storing. You can move to different resource group though. Like, I mean, resources can move. Like I could move the VM to another resource group, but I cannot have them exist in two ones.
Got it.
And an application can utilize basically multiple resources. You had a question?
Great. So actually, I just when you were explaining, I could
Mm,
also relate it to one more point, which is I consider resource group as a folder or a virtual
mm.
folder where
Yeah.
I can put all the resources in. So I think this is clearly understood.
When we talk about resource group, on top of resource group, there's also something called Azure Subscription. Azure Subscription, every account actually needs a subscription. When you start off with the Azure, there's always a subscription. And subscriptions could be tied to a resource. So why do you win subscription? You might have multiple subscriptions too. So you might have a subscription for your department, finance department, your IT department, or your developer department. Whichever one you have, you could actually have different subscription to it and different resources aligned to those subscriptions. So you could invoice them separately. So you might have a budget that goes to, I don't know, IT department is different, and compared
Mm,
to developer department could be different. So you could actually use different subscription. So it provides you a billing boundary between these subscriptions, and you could have access control over it in some ways, so that you don't have people from developers going into IT and then trying to muck around with things, for example.
yes, yes. So one of the questions which I got over here is, what are the pros of having multiple subscriptions? So one of them you told me about access control, but
Mm.
does it also mean that I cannot move my resources between subscriptions like I used to do in resource groups?
No, you could move the resources to, but I think it's best to actually to give access rather than moving it. So, for example, that you might have a resource that I don't know, finance might need to audit a resource in IT, for example. So you might actually give access to that resource group specifically, rather than moving that whole resource group to finance, for example. So what makes more sense is basically having access control. So because they might not need the whole access to the environment, for example, the resource, the VM running. Maybe they just need the billing of it, for example. So you
Got it.
might actually give them those access for it. So I think that's more of the way to manage it.
Clear,
Okay,
clear.
now you might say, okay, now that we have subscription, we have resources and all that stuff. What about like if I have many departments? Like, I mean, I have hundreds of departments. What do I do? So you could actually have another logical pair on top of it. It's called management groups. So management group is basically where the subscription happens, and then the resource group, and then the resources, basically. So you might say that, okay, I have, because I have multiple groups, I might have a finance department and the IT department or HR department. All of these are using Azure resources, but I want to separate them with subscription, and I don't want to be managing all of them. I want to be able to manage. I don't want to manage individual of them. I want to manage all of them. So that's where the management group comes in, where basically your subscription is inherent conditions. Basically, you might say that I only give, I don't know, $10 to this group, or I might give like 100,000 to this other group. So you could actually control all of this stuff by using a managed group.
That's great. I can read one more thing over here, which
Mm,
says that a management group tree can support up to 6 levels of depth. So, what do
mm.
you mean by 6 levels of depth? Is this the hierarchy of the management groups?
Exactly. So there's the hierarchy of it. There's subscription, and then resource group, and then resources, and then you could actually have like more groups within it or more resources within it. So that's why there's only like up to 6 levels for it.
Cool, cool. I think that is so informative, and I agree. The point you made in the start that we have been using Azure since long, but these things are very important on what exactly management groups are, what is your Azure subscription, how you can actually create your resource, or what it is called as the virtual container, that is the resource groups, and mainly where your applications are hosted. So one of the things which clears a lot in your mind is about the Azure regions. That
Mhm.
for Azure regions, one of the things which I had a question also was, would the bandwidth be charged to us? But no, as you said, that it's a kind of a backup which was provided by Microsoft to each paired regions in that case. So I think that's one of the things which clears up a lot of basic concepts for us when you're working with Azure.
Exactly. There's two things that actually trickled my mind from your conversation was basically now when you talk about network traffic sort of thing, you still have to think about network traffic as in like if I'm moving myself from one region to another, the outbound traffic, it's still going to be costing you something. Do you understand?
Yes,
So all of a sudden you're moving from Dubai to like I don't know Western Europe or something like that. There's still going to be a cost associated with it. So you need to make sure that you're counting those costs because there's a bandwidth that goes in and out sort of thing. So within that region, there's no bandwidth cost, but like when you go out to
yes,
another kind of there's a cost. So you need to be careful. Now the second thing is like that triggered me. Maybe in the next episode we could talk about how we could actually specifically show a demo of like how we could limit people to do certain things within a resource group, for example. If you have a subscription and you don't want people to launch certain VMs, for example, you could actually put a budget or like put some kind of a restrictions of it that they cannot delete or something like that. So we'll showcase that too. That gives me a great idea for it.
that's great actually, and that would open up one more conversation of how you can actually. So I've seen some companies or customers who actually are afraid of giving access to their developers to the Azure account, right? So this actually gives them also an idea about how you can freely still give access to the developers, but only give access to what is required or what they can actually manage from that. So still the management can control if the resources are created, or if scenarios like this in that case.
Cool. So Hatim, let's get started on some of the questions that I might ask you right now. So,
That's a surprise to me.
I'm going to ask you, what is the Azure feature or resource regions across regions that are 300 miles away? Are they region pairs? Are they availability zone, sovereignty region, or global reach? What is it?
Yes. So this is region based for sure, but for me, I don't think so. For UAE, they are 300 miles away.
Okay. So the next question I have is, so how many resource group can a resource be in the same time? So one resource, how many resource group can it be in? One, two, three, or four?
Yeah, one resource group. I think it should have only one at the same time.
Exactly. Cool.
That's great.
Last question. What happens to the resource group when an action or setting or resource group level is applied? So think about the hierarchy. So is it more like the current resource just inherits the settings, but future resources don't? Or is it the future resources inherit the setting, but current one doesn't? Or is it the setting is applied to the current and the future resources, or nothing changes?
Yes. So, yes, it should actually apply, or it applies to both current and the future resources, because you're setting up a rule, and that rule will be applied if you have an existing resource on that, or if you have any future resources as well on that.
Excellent. Thank you, team. That's pretty
Thank
much
you.
it. That concludes the regions and everything else. I hope everybody learned something today.
Thanks a lot, Tashwa, for sharing all this information. For sure, I learned a lot of things,
Mhm.
and see you again in the next episode.
See you. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you. Have a good day. Bye bye.